Hello all. This is going to be a short video to introduce the Lucian or Koine pronunciation of ancient Greek. This is a pronunciation that is developed and most associated with Luke Ranieri, who runs the YouTube channel Polymathy, which I'm going to link to. He goes into this pronunciation a great deal and in a lot of detail. I'm just going to summarize what I think is the usefulness of it and summarize the main features of it. So the obvious question is, why should we bother with a new pronunciation of ancient Greek? Well, on the one hand, the Erasmian, or what is sometimes inaccurately called the reconstructed pronunciation, that is the pronunciation that most of us use in learning Greek, especially in classics departments, is, on the one hand, it's very inconsistent in that really no two people almost pronounce it exactly the same. And there are wide variations between how it's pronounced by Americans or the French or the Germans. It's a very wide variety. And second, it doesn't really actually reflect the pronunciation of Greek as it was ever really spoken in any period. Some of its features are much too conservative and are held on to long after they would have been spoken. And some of its features are much more advanced and progressive. For instance, almost everyone universally pronounces the aspirated consonants as fricatives. By the time that was the case in reality, a whole lot of other changes had taken place that are usually ignored in practice. And there are just so many of these inconsistencies and temporal inconsistencies that it's really just an arbitrary mishmash of a pronunciation. On the other hand, the main alternative to the Erasmian pronunciation, which is the modern Greek pronunciation, which I really like, and it has a lot of advantages, and it sounds quite aesthetically pleasing in my opinion. But it has really an unacceptable number of homophonous words, which are unnecessarily complicated. For instance, in modern Greek, hemis and humis are both pronounced imis, and these verb forms here are all pronounced bi, which can certainly cause a lot of confusion if you are attempting to read Greek aloud or speak ancient Greek, or indeed just reading Greek to yourself, because the sound is actually important to the meaning even if you are reading silently. So ideally, we would want to use a pronunciation that is, one, consistently pronounced between speakers and between speakers of different nationalities, and is as close to the living language as possible so that we can listen to native speakers and kind of mimic their sounds. But that, two, distinguishes the sounds that mark important grammatical functions, like imis being pronounced differently above. And three, it would be nice to have one that represents Greek as it was actually spoken at a definite point in history, and not an arbitrary mishmash of archaic and progressive features. This pronunciation, as Luke Ranieri goes into in great detail in the video that I'm going to link, is the Lucian pronunciation. So I'm not going to go over all of the details. I'm just sort of going to go over how you get from an Erasmian-like pronunciation to this pronunciation, and then from a modern Greek pronunciation to this pronunciation. So if you're used to Erasmian, basically here is the full list of the changes that you would have to make. It's not many, and all of these are really fully justified historically. The first thing is that the epsilon iota diphthong or pseudodiphthong is raised to e, as in ireka. This is going to sound strange to most of us probably, but this is actually probably the most justifiable sound change. This change happened in the late classical period already. There's a very good chance that Demosthenes, and if not Demosthenes, Alexander, or certainly people that they knew and could have met, had this sound change. So this is actually a very ancient change. This is not a modern Greek invention. The same thing with changing zeta to just z, like in sozo. This one also probably happened in the 4th century BC, so this is also a very early change. And then a group of these three changes here, the voiced stops that we're used to saying as ba, da, and ga are changed to fricatives as to vivlion, baedes vuo, and ego or egeneto. The gamma has a different pronunciation if it's before back vowels versus front vowels. And again, this sounds strange to us, but actually this pronunciation change happened, if not in the classical period, certainly in the early Hellenistic period for most speakers, starting seemingly with the Macedonians, but certainly in place for most speakers, maybe by the 2nd century BC. So this is also quite an early sound change. And that's about it. If you're used to an Erasmian pronunciation, assuming that theta, phi, and chi are tha, fa, and cha or hi, and that you don't pronounce the iota subscript, that's basically the full set of sound changes that you need to make to get to a Lucian pronunciation. And if you're coming at this from the opposite direction, from modern Greek, there are also very few sound changes that you have to make, and all of them are actually fairly important for distinguishing meaning. The first is that vowel length and rough breathing need to be pronounced. So this phrase, instead of being as it would be in modern Greek, outos oanthropos, would be poutos hoanthropos. Note that the omega is long even though it is in an unaccented syllable, and the alpha is accented even though it is short, anthropos. And then you have just these few vowel and diphthong changes. Eta is eh. It probably doesn't matter if you make it eh or a, because epsilon iota has already been raised to e, so this is there's no risk of confusion. So hemis, upsilon is u, so humis, hemis and humis. Alpha iota is I, as we're used to, so ekinai, and omicron iota is I would say oi, so ekinoi. Luc Ranieri recommends pronouncing this as a, which is sort of the medial sound that it had between the classical oi and the later Koine u, a. But if you just say ekinoi, that is undoubtedly sufficient. And that is effectively the only sound changes that you need to make to go from a modern Greek pronunciation to the Lucian or Koine pronunciation. An exception that I wanted to talk about separately is the diphthongs or pseudo-diphthongs, ow and ow. The pronunciation of these in this period is really a sound found neither in the Erasmian restored pronunciation nor in the modern Greek pronunciation, but is halfway between both and intelligible to speakers of both. I would say that these, it doesn't matter as much how you pronounce them because they are not important for distinguishing meaning very often. But if you want to follow the Lucian pronunciation, the sound of these is going to be the phonological symbolism here is a bit difficult to follow. This is sort of an aftos and auvrion. To me, and probably to you, this sounds as like you're saying auf and auv, which is, again, like halfway a mismatch between Erasmian and modern Greek. It's not quite that, but it's close. Aftos and auvrion. And epsilon, upsilon would be oaf and ov, which again sounds like oaf and ov, but it's not quite. So tois vasileufsi and to evangelion. And that's it. Those few changes will get you to the Lucian pronunciation. So it's really quite close to Erasmian and also quite close to modern Greek and sort of halfway in between them. So just as a summary of the advantages of this pronunciation, first, it represents the sound of ancient Greek as it was actually spoken by a large number of speakers in a period of antiquity, roughly, say, between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. This is how ancient Greek was actually spoken, which is not the case for the Erasmian pronunciation in any period. On the other hand, at the same time, it's quite close to the pronunciation of modern Greek, so that we can listen to native speakers and mimic their phonology, and so get a much better spoken ancient Greek, and so get a much better accent. And third, it nonetheless maintains important grammatical distinctions in speech, such as distinguishing hemis and humis, and poi, poie, and poioi, and it maintains vowel length distinctions. So, just for an example of this pronunciation, here is the opening of Xenophon's Anabasis. Variu, kai periustatidos ignontai paides dio, presbyteros men artaxerxes, neoteros de kyros. Epide esteni darios, kai hypopter ve teloften tu viu, evuletoto paide amphotero parinai. Hominum presbyteros paron etynchane, kyronde metapempetai apotes arches, hes afton satrapen epoiese, kai strategonde afton apedixe pandon hosoies casto lu pedion afroizontai. Anavainiun ho kyros, lavontis fernen hos philon, kai ton elenon ekon hoplitas aneve triacosius, archonta de afton xenian parrasion. Epide et eleftes et arios, kai keteste isten Vasilian Artaxerxes, tis afernes dia valiton kyron proston adelphon, hos epivu levoi afto. Hod epithetai, kai sulemvani kyron hos apoktenon. Hedemeter exaites amene afton apopempi, palin epiten archen.